Hello and welcome to the Orthodox Oasis. My name is Drew over here in Emus, and what you're about to watch is a VOD of the Orthodox Oasis over on Twitch. So feel free to join us live as we play games, hang out, and chat about Orthodox stuff. Otherwise, enjoy this VOD and we'll see you soon. Have a great day.
On this whole podcast, this whole American Orthodox history program, I won't be going along in a strictly chronological order. I might talk about an event from the 1920s in one episode and then jump back to the 1870s in the next. But here at the outset, I think it would be helpful for us to just have a brief discussion of the basics of early American Orthodoxy. The point of this being to provide a framework for future discussion. Now, I must stress that what I'm about to say is a very, very rudimentary overview of American Orthodox history. I'll be leaving a lot of things out and oversimplifying a great deal. But I do think this is necessary so that going forward we're all on the same page. So today, really, my focus is going to be on some of the basics of American Orthodox history leading up to the turn of the 20th century. Now, when you typically ask people about American Orthodoxy and American Orthodox history, they will think of 1794. Now, that year, of course, is when the first Russian mission arrived on Kodiak Island in Alaska. And the mission consisted of 8 Russian monks from Valam Monastery, and among them was St. Herman of Alaska, also St. Juvenali. And there are a couple things about the mission that I wanted to briefly touch on. I'm not going to go into detail about Alaskan Orthodoxy today because we'll be talking about it in much greater detail very soon. But a couple things about that first mission. One is that it was actually a domestic mission. It was within the Russian Empire. Alaska at the time was a part of Russia, and the natives that were being evangelized were at least nominally subjects of the Tsar. So despite the fact that it was the missionary journey from Valam across Siberia to Alaska is considered to be the longest missionary journey in church history, it actually never left the Russian Empire. They never crossed any borders. And the other important, interesting thing that I think is often overlooked about early Alaskan Orthodoxy is that the Russian mission was not the first arrival of Orthodoxy in Alaska. There actually was an Orthodox presence in Alaska for a half century prior to the mission in the form of laymen, Russian laymen, who came over to Alaska to do business. They were traders or trappers, and they would interact with the natives. They would share their faith with them, and in some cases they would convert these natives to Orthodoxy. They would baptize them. There would be intermarriage between these Russian men and native women. So there were natives when the missionaries first arrived in 1794. There actually were native people there who were familiar with Orthodoxy and had even embraced it in some cases. Certainly this wasn't the majority of natives, but it shouldn't be overlooked. Now, the next major person I briefly want to mention is St. Innocent. I can't ignore St. Innocent when I do an overview of early American Orthodoxy. He, of course, was a great missionary and a visionary, really. He was originally a priest in America.
Who did you say that was? Saint Innocent? Let's look him up. I really should save before I jump into this cave in the middle of nowhere. Alright, let's try that again. There we go. How bad is it? I think I've fought these guys before. So that was Saint Innocent. Innocent of Alaska. Orthodox Wiki, of course. Well, these guys aren't that bad at all. Weird little cave down here. Let's see here. Our Father among the saints, innocent of Alaska, equal to the apostles, an enlightener of North America from 1797 to 1879. So that is 80-ish years. Eye drops. Was a Russian Orthodox priest, bishop, archbishop, and metropolitan of Moscow in all Russia. He is known for his missionary work, scholarship, and leadership in Alaska and in the Russian Far East during the 1800s. He is known for his great zeal for work, as well as his great abilities as a scholar, linguist, and administrator. He was a missionary, later a bishop and an archbishop in Alaska and the Russian Far East. Oh, no. Wait. You just lose it? Oh, no. Oh, look. Everybody needed to use a high potion all of a sudden. Oh, that's so weird. Oh, my goodness. You disgusting blob monsters. He's known for his great zeal, his missionary. Yep. He learned several native. Are you guys not doing any damage? When in doubt, use magic. Actually, they're most likely to use magic themselves. Missionary. He learned several native languages. Pretty cool. Was author of many of the earliest scholarly works about the natives and their languages, as well as dictionaries, religious works in these languages. He also translated parts of the Bible into several native languages. Oh, he's got a name. Let's see here. Let's see if you can do any damage now. Saint Innocent Ivan John Evsevievich Popov Veniaminov was born on August 26, 1797 to a family of a church server in the village of Angitskoye. In the Verkhovsk district, Irkutsk province in Russia. I'll just finish him off this way. His father died when John was 6. In 1807, John entered the Irkutsk Theology Seminary. In 1817, he married. On the May 18th, 1870, he was ordained a deacon of the Church of the Annunciation in Irkutsk. Completed his studies in 1818, appointed a teacher. So how did he and his family built an earthen hut, constructed a church. Oh, look, a high potion. Ooh. Who's poisoned? You stop that right now, bucko. They arrived. He and his family and aging mother arrived in Alaska in 1824. Began construction, studying local languages and dialects. So they were on an island called Alaska. got 2 more to get. Okay. Mastered 6 local dialects, devised an alphabet for the most widespread dialect in Unungan dialect of Aleut. In 1934, he was transferred to Sitka Island to the town of Novorkhanglitsk and began to minister to the people of Tlingit. Produced a couple books about the people, or treatises more like. An ether, those are good. In 1838, he returned to St. Petersburg and Moscow and Kiev, Ukraine, to report his activities and request an expansion of church activities. Interesting. Right, he was doing that, received a notice that his wife had passed away. He requested permission to return to Sitka. Instead, it was suggested that he take vows as a monk. He ignored these at first, but eventually he made his vows. Chose the name Innocent in honor of the Bishop Innocent of Irkutsk. No. Oh, stop pushing the wrong buttons. Still 0 damage, even with an attack increase. Interesting. Infinite. In 1840, he was consecrated bishop of the local area. Okay. Lived a good life and died peacefully. Excellent. Given 2 feast days, October 6th and March 31st. Cool.
Alaska. And when his wife died in 1840, he was consecrated a bishop to be the first bishop for Alaska, and the diocese received the name the Diocese of Irkutsk and the Kuril and Aleutian Islands. St. Innocent translated church texts, service books, liturgical books into native languages. He even invented a native alphabet, and in 1867 he became the Metropolitan of Moscow. That same year, Alaska was sold by the Russian Empire to the United States of America. And many of the Russian people in Alaska returned to Russia at the time of the sale. And there was a belief among some that the Russian church in Alaska should pull out of Alaska because Alaska was no longer a part of the empire. St. Innocent heard a rumor that he himself was upset about the sale of Alaska. And he actually took the time to respond to this rumor, and I'm going to briefly talk about his response because it's very interesting. He said, it's utterly false. He does not think the sale of Alaska is a bad thing. He's perfectly comfortable with it and happy with it. He says he sees it as one of the ways of providence whereby Orthodoxy will penetrate the United States. And he advised that the Russian Church, rather than close the Alaskan mission, move the headquarters from Alaska down to San Francisco and begin really aggressive missionary work among English-speaking Americans. He wanted them to recall the present bishop in Alaska and replace him with one who knew English. And he wanted to have English-speaking clergy in Alaska. He wanted service books translated into English, English language instruction in church schools, and English language services in churches. He really had as his aim the conversion of the Americans, the people of the United States. A remarkable vision, unfortunately one which was not really followed by the Russian Church. They did move the headquarters of the mission down to San Francisco, but aside from that, there wasn't much effort to reach out to the English-speaking people in America. Outside of Alaska, between the sale of Alaska and about 1890 or so, there were only 3 Orthodox parishes in the United States. One of them was a Greek parish in New Orleans, Louisiana, which was connected with the Greek consulate, sort of loosely tied with the Church of Greece. There was also a Russian church which became the cathedral in San Francisco, and there was a Russian chapel in New York City. The New York chapel was connected with the Russian authorities in America and really was supposed to be kind of an embassy church almost, serving the needs of the Russian officials in America. And it also, its priest was actually a convert from Roman Catholicism named Nicholas Biering, and he saw as part of his job to be a kind of religious ambassador of the Russian Church to the Episcopal Church in America, with whom the Orthodox had pretty close relations in the 19th century. And Biering actually explicitly discouraged inquirers. He said his intention was not to make converts, even though he himself was a convert. So all 3 of the Orthodox parishes in America were really focused on taking care of the needs of their own people and or fostering sort of ecumenical relations with the Episcopalians. No real broader sense of mission. Biering, his chapel was shut down in 1883 by the Russian government. They closed it apparently to save some money. They didn't really want to continue to maintain it, and Biering was very discouraged about this. They had offered him a job as a professor in Russia itself, a prestigious position, but Biering, very unhappy, left the Orthodox Church instead and became a Presbyterian. And so the Russian Church had pulled out of New York, and in fact, their only Russian parish, by 1890, the only Russian parish in the United States was in San Francisco. The only other Orthodox parish in the U.S. was the Greek Church in New Orleans. Everything changed after 1890. 2 major things happened simultaneously that would forever alter the course of American Orthodox history. Up to this point, Orthodoxy in America, really there are just a couple pockets. It's pretty minimal. But after 1890, you had a flood of immigrants, Orthodox immigrants, to the eastern seaboard of the United States. People coming from the Mediterranean, from Greece, or from the Middle East, from Eastern Europe.
Which, apparently a lot of Greece people brought hot dogs and stuff to America, and I love hot dogs and chili dogs, and they're delicious, and thank you Greek people for that. I was watching a video today while we were eating dinner about hot dogs. There were hot dogs across the country. Love a good hot dog. Hot dogs!
Coming to America, many of them coming through Ellis Island, and most of these people were young men. The numbers vary depending on the ethnic group, anywhere from 2/3 men to 90% or more men, depending on which ethnic group you look at.
That's a lot of dudes!
These young men would come over and seek their fortune, and many of them would go back home to the old country and sometimes make multiple trips across the Atlantic. Some of the immigrants to America were very intent on maintaining their Orthodox faith, and so they established Orthodox churches. In the very early 1890s, 2 Orthodox churches were established in New York City, which had been abandoned by the Russian Church. One of the churches established was under the Archbishop of Athens. The other one was under the Patriarchate of Constantinople. Both of them Greek. And these parishes were established by a boards of trustees, a group of laymen who wanted to have a parish and would organize themselves and then send for a priest from the old country. And these
sword, shield, and spear. Excellent.
Lay boards of trustees became the dominant feature of Greek parishes and also Serbian and other Orthodox ethnic parishes in America in these years. These boards of trustees would hire and fire their priests, and they would determine who was eligible to partake of the sacraments. I mean, in many respects, there was a lot of chaos among many of the Orthodox in America. At the same time, these people should be given credit for maintaining their Orthodox faith and for establishing these parishes, which ultimately led to the Orthodoxy in America that we have today, for better and worse. And the Greek parishes were independent, mostly. They had loose ties to the old world, but they were largely independent. Basically, they were run by the board of trustees. The other major phenomenon, though, that was taking place at the same time was the mass conversion of former Uniates, Eastern Rite Catholics, to the Orthodox faith. In the early 1890s, a Uniate priest named Alexis Toth was in Minneapolis and had a run-in with the local Roman Catholic bishop who was in authority over him. And the bishop did not like Uniates, and St. Alexis and the bishop had words, and St. Alexis decided to become Orthodox. And long story short, he did, and ended up leading thousands upon thousands of former Uniates into the Orthodox Church, whole communities, whole churches. And I believe that St. Alexis can rightfully be called the father of the OCA, because the many parishes that he brought into the Orthodox Church formed the core of the Russian mission and ultimately the core of what we know today as the OCA. Between the Uniate conversions and the immigration in the 1890s, there was just the numbers of Orthodox were increasing exponentially. And the Russian church responded to this by sending very well qualified, very talented clergy to America to foster and encourage the conversion of Uniates and to take care of these parishes that were coming into the church. Two of the most exemplary of these priests were Father John Kochorov, who went to Chicago, and Father Alexander Hodovitsky, who went to New York. And of course, both of them, the names may sound familiar, both of them went on to return to Russia and were martyred by the communists and are now saints. Those two priests, about the same time that they came to America, another important priest came to America, Father Raphael Hawawini. Father Raphael was a Syrian, and he came under the auspices of the Russian church to minister to the Syrians in America. He came at the request of the Syrians in New York, but he was nominally connected with the Russian church, still had strong ties with the Antiochian church as well. And Father Raphael ultimately became Bishop Raphael, and we now know him as Saint Raphael. He came in the year 1895. A few years later, in 1898, Saint Tikhon arrived to be the new bishop of the Russian mission, and the name of the mission after St. Tikhon's arrival was changed in 1900 to the Diocese of the Aleutian Islands and North America. And shortly thereafter, the headquarters was moved from San Francisco to New York City. And this really signified a shift in focus, in the diocese focus, from Alaska and the Pacific to the Atlantic coast, the East Coast, and these former Uniates. I've left out a great deal. I haven't really spoken at all about the Serbs or the Romanians or many of the other groups in America. What I hope I've done today is given you at least a very basic introduction to 19th century Orthodoxy in America. And we'll be fleshing all of this out, believe me, in the weeks and months and hopefully years to come. And I certainly have left out an enormous amount. Please feel free to send an email and let me know if you are interested in anything in particular that you want me to speak about. because while I do have a sort of game plan going forward, I'm very open to suggestions and questions and so forth. I appreciate your listening, and I look forward to speaking with you next time. Thank you.
You've been listening to American Orthodox History with Matthew Namey.
Interesting. Chicago, 1888.
Hi, this is Bill Marianis, host of the live call-in show Stewardship.
The Orthodox Church is the historical church, the church of holy tradition. And those who count themselves as Orthodox Christians share a uniquely historical consciousness, understanding that the saints, priests, and Orthodox laymen of the past play a crucial part in their journeys toward salvation. However, there is one area of Orthodox history that very few of us know anything about: the story of Orthodoxy in the Americas. Ancient Faith Radio is thus happy to present American Orthodox History with Matthew Namey.
Welcome back to American Orthodox History. Today I'd like to talk about a remarkable thing that almost happened. In 1888, a pan-Orthodox parish was almost established in Chicago. It never happened, which is why you've probably never heard this story. But all the same, I think it's a story that deserves to be told. Now, Orthodoxy barely existed in America in 1888. Of course, there were numerous churches in Alaska, but that was a world away from what we would today call the lower 48. In the continental United States, the only Orthodox churches in 1888 were the Russian Cathedral in San Francisco and the Greek parish in New Orleans. Incidentally, only the San Francisco church acknowledged the authority of the Russian bishop. The New Orleans parish appears to have been loosely connected to the Church of Greece, but was mostly independent. New York City, the largest city in the country, did not have an Orthodox church, and Chicago, the second largest city, was also without an Orthodox parish. But in the 1880s, Greeks, Serbs, and other ethnic Orthodox began to trickle into Chicago. Sometime in the middle of the decade, a Montenegrin saloon keeper named Gopchevich wrote a letter to the Russian ambassador in Washington. Gopchevich thought that there should be an Orthodox parish in Chicago, and he wanted the Russian government to send a priest and build a church. The Russian ambassador forwarded Gopchevich's letter onto the Russian Holy Synod, and eventually it reached Bishop Vladimir, the new Russian bishop in San Francisco. Now, this apparently took several years, and I would guess that part of the reason for the delay was the fact that there was no Russian bishop in America for over 5 years, from 1882 to 1888. But that is a story for another day. Anyway, in May of 1888, Gopchevich finally received a reply to his letter. Bishop Vladimir asked Gopchevich to organize a meeting of all the Orthodox in Chicago to see how many people were interested in starting a church. Vladimir planned to visit the city later in the year, and he wanted to know what to expect. The meeting was held on May 13th. Now, rather than summarize the meeting myself, I'm going to mostly just read to you the article in the Chicago Daily Tribune that came out the next day. But don't worry, this isn't the kind of dry newspaper account you'd read today. Newspapers back in the 1880s were really, really entertaining, and I could not possibly do a better job of summarizing the meeting than the Chicago Tribune writer did at the time. He wrote, Mr. K.M. Gopchevich, a Montenegrin with black hair and a light mustache, called the Greek Catholic meeting to order today. Now, I'm going to break in here and point out that the secular media in the 1880s knew even less about Orthodoxy than they do today. We're talking here about Orthodox Christians, but the reporter calls them Greek Catholics, which was a common misconception back then. Anyway, to continue, all the Greek Catholics of Chicago were represented in the assembly. There were Athenians and Spartans, islanders of the archipelago, sailors from the seaports of Asia Minor, and there were Slavs of all nationalities, Dalmatians from Ragusa and the Boca al Cataro, Serbians from Prizren and Belgrade, Bulgarians from Rustchuk. Only one Russian was in the hall, which was at number 118 Fifth Avenue, and he, feeling out of place, retired before the meeting was over. A small Greek in a pea jacket, who might have been a pirate but was really a dealer in coffee and spice, mounted the platform and discoursed with another Greek in hexameters and pentameters. He was so rapid in his utterance, so excited in his gesture,
Yo.
that a Serbian at the other end of the hall called him to order.
Yo. The newspapers back then were spanking, baby. Let's go. What happened to our media?
The small Greek, who seemed to be on the point of drawing a knife to give point to his...
Am I listening to a news report or am I reading Sir Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes? That's the kind of stuff he would write.
remarks, subsided in an instant, and his Serbian conqueror demanded that hereafter the language of Thucydides should be discarded, and that of Robert G. Ingersoll should be adopted. The Serbian youths, the lads who had witnessed Prince Alexander's overthrow, understood not a word of either speaker, but they mildly applauded their compatriot. Mr. Gopchevich then drew from his pocket the letter which had occasioned the meeting. Time was when Mr. Gopchevich had worn a yataghan at his side and a fez upon his head. Time was when Mr. Gopchevich had looked along the barrel of a long rifle and had picked off Turks as they clambered over his native rocks. Time was when Mr. Gopchevich, under the leadership of a soldier priest, had scaled hills, had burnt villages, had hidden in caves, had rolled huge boulders down upon the enemy. Mr. Gopchevich went through every recent Montenegrin revolution. He has fought invaders like the sturdy mountaineer that he was. And today, he keeps a saloon on West 22nd Street and is a modest, self-contained man with a record that many an American general might envy. Do you see what I mean about the newspapers in the 1880s? This writer has basically taken a semi-boring religious meeting of Greeks and Serbs and turned it into this grand tale with vivid characters and gripping dialogue. Anyway, to continue. But before Mr. Gopchevich could read the letter, Mr. George Brown, a veteran of our own war, which I take to mean the Civil War, was called to the chair. He was quite a boy when he came from Samos, and he was somewhat misty in his recollections of the Isles of Greece, where burning Sappho loved and sung. Still, there was the old Greek spirit in the vigor with which he rapped the table with his walking stick and bade Serbians and Greeks to give ear to the following Homeric speech. "Gentlemen," he said, "union is the strength. Let everybody make his mind and have no jealousy. I have no jealousy. I am married to a Catholic woman, but I hold my own. Let us stick like a brothers. If our language is two, our religion is one. The priest he make the performance in both language. We have our flags built. It is the first Greek flags raised in Chicago. We will surprise the Americans. Let us stick like a brothers. And now, gentlemen, if you will please sit down, will you? Sit down, you Serbian gentlemen. Rap, rap, rap with the walking stick. We shall like to hear something from you." Mr. J. Vucetich, the president of the Serbian Society, rose to reply. "He is as handsome a Slav as ever rowed a boat on the Adriatic. Tall, erect, graceful as a Greek god. He had served in the Dalmatian regiments against the Turks, and on many a war vessel that had sailed at midnight from Bokadi Katara. He glowed with enthusiasm when Montenegro's battle for freedom was mentioned, and he vowed that if his countrymen needed his dagger or his gun, he would go back in the mountains tomorrow. Having, however, no immediate occasion to depart, he delivered the following reply. Gentlemen, he said, it is important we shall all put in our shoulder. I hope there will be one meeting in the June and one in the July to prescribe the money for our purpose. I have nothing to say for present. I see everybody satisfied with business as we translate tonight." Mr. Gopchevich then read the letter. It was written by Bishop Vladimir, who had lately arrived in San Francisco from Russia. The bishop had conceived the project of establishing a Greek church in Chicago, and he suggested to Mr. Gopchevich that all the Greeks, Serbians, Bulgarians, and Russians in the city should sign a petition, which he would forward to the Holy Synod and should raise funds to establish a church and pay a preacher. This was the purpose for which Mr. Brown had advised his hearers to stick like a brothers, and Mr. Vucetich had counseled them to prescribe the money. The signing of the petition was a task of much difficulty. Some of the Greeks had names like Nikolaos Christolambros and Dimitri Korfiatis, and they spent as much time spelling them out as though they were writing a book of the Iliad. Others signed for the whole family, as Pietros Poulos, George Poulos, Johns Poulos. Others could not sign at all, and their names were affixed by the zealous Mr. Gopchevich. Among the latter was a handsome but diminutive youth with a rose at his buttonhole and thick black hair plastered over his forehead. He was the latest arrival from Athens, where he was considered quite an Adonis. What had he to tell of Athens? He knew many pretty women there. Had he ever been to Marathon? He had never heard of Marathon.
Monsters!
What did he think of the Parthenon? He had never heard of the Parthenon. Had he read Sophocles or Euripides? He could not read or write, but he was quite a fashionable youth in modern Athens. So the petition was signed at last, and then the older men gathered round the platform and told of old Greek liberty. "There is not one of us," said Mr. Gopchevich, "but knows that noble verse by heart, 'The mountains look on Marathon, and Marathon looks on the sea. And standing there an hour alone, I dreamt that Greece might yet be free. For standing by the Persian grave, I could not deem myself a slave.'" Now, Mr. Gopchevich is quoting here from a Byron poem. Anyway, that was the Chicago Tribune's account of the meeting.
Phoenix down, let's go.
Of course, the Tribune wasn't the only paper that reported on the story. There were many, many newspapers in Chicago. And among the others was the Chicago Daily Inter-Ocean, which is perhaps more informative but far less entertaining.
Wild
From the Inter-Ocean,
Horns?
we learned
Oh, no.
that there were roughly 1,000 Orthodox in Chicago at the time. About 600 Greeks and 400 Slavs, which included Serbs, Montenegrins, Bulgarians, Russians, and so forth. About 100 men attended the meeting. Gopchevich,
Where's Montenegro at? I know it's in the Mediterranean, but I want to know the exact Montenegro. Where are you? Oh, it's right next to Kosovo? What am I thinking over by... Montenegro? What's over... What are these? What are you? I'm thinking of Monaco. No, not Monaco. Why does Monaco show up like that? Is Monaco really that small? Are you serious? Oh, Casino de Monte Carlo. Yes. Do these belong to... looks like these two big islands belong to Italy. So Montenegro's over here. Right next to Serbia, Kosovo, Albania, and Bosnia and Herzegovina. Or Herzegovina. Alright, back to it.
the Montenegrin, was elected secretary, while George Brown, the Greek, was chosen as chairman. And here's something from the Inter-Ocean that didn't appear in the Tribune. They write, "A question was raised as to the language to be used by the priest in reading the service and in delivering the sermon. There are 600 Greeks in Chicago, with only 400 Slavs, but as the Russian government was to build the edifice, it was agreed that the St. Petersburg authorities be allowed to determine this point," the language issue. At the San Francisco church, Greek and Slavonic are used on alternate Sundays, and it is possible that the plan will be established here. As it turned out, the Pan-Orthodox parish never was established in Chicago. Bishop Vladimir did visit in October, but that was about it.
That's so sad.
So why did it fail? Why couldn't they start a church? The reason, it seems, centers around Bishop Vladimir himself. See, right around this time, Bishop Vladimir became embroiled in an extremely messy scandal in San Francisco. He was accused of all kinds of terrible things, and to this day, the truth of that mess is not entirely clear. And what's more, our friend Mr. Gopchevich, his brother was one of the leading opponents of Bishop Vladimir in San Francisco. So by 1891, a few years after this meeting, Gopchevich himself was elected president of Chicago's Orthodox Society, and the group had decided to remain independent of Bishop Vladimir, and they sent a petition to the Russian government telling them so. The Chicago Orthodox also wrote to the Ecumenical Patriarch asking for a priest. But as I said, the Pan-Orthodox parish never happened. In April of 1892, the Greek Society in Chicago obtained for themselves a priest from the Church of Greece sent by the Archbishop of Athens. This parish, Annunciation, was to be exclusively Greek. A month later, the very next month, a Russian parish was established in Chicago by the Russian authorities. It's a bit of a disappointing end to the story to end up with two ethnically separated parishes. What seemed so promising in 1888 had fallen apart by the early 1890s, and it's natural to wonder, what if? What if someone other than Bishop Vladimir had been the Russian bishop? What if a pan-Orthodox parish had taken root in Chicago? Now, we obviously can't answer that question with certainty. However, we can look at what happened in another city, Seattle, Washington. See, at about the same time, in 1892, a pan-Orthodox parish was founded in Seattle. It was named for Saint Spiridon, a Greek saint, but it was under the jurisdiction of the Russian bishop. The first priest of Saint Spiridon's was a man named Father Ambrose Vreta, and he had previously been the first pastor of the Russian church in Chicago. The community's fourth priest in Seattle was Father Michael Andriades, who was a rare ethnic Greek who served in the Russian archdiocese, which was extremely uncommon. St. Spiridon's included not only Greeks and Russians, but also Serbs, Carpatho-Rusins, Bulgarians, Syro-Arabs, and Gypsies. Church services were held in Greek, Russian, and English. But as the Greek population of Seattle swelled to nearly 2,000 by 1916, Greek members of St. Spiridon's decided to form their own parish. Father John Erickson writes that the division of what had been one parish seemed to have aroused no hard feelings. The remaining parishioners of St. Spiridon expressed joy because now there were enough Orthodox in Seattle for two churches. When the new parish formed, they escorted the Greek community in solemn procession to the new church. All parishes, Erickson says, seem to have considered it perfectly natural to organize church life along ethnic lines. And I think we can say that it's likely that eventually something similar would have happened in the pan-Orthodox Chicago parish had it ever been established. The Orthodox all over America were dividing along ethnic lines, and even more than that, they were dividing along village lines, regional lines. The different ethnic groups stuck together as long as they were small, but as their numbers grew, so did their desire to separate. But we shouldn't forget this very early pan-Orthodox effort in Chicago. At the very least, let's remember the words of George Brown, the Greek veteran of the American Civil War, who said, "Union is the strength. Let everybody make his mind and have no jealousy. We will surprise the Americans."
You've been listening to American Orthodox History with Matthew Namey.
Man, newspapers were awesome back in the day, apparently. And probably a little racist, but that's okay. That's just how it was back then. Let's see here. Oh, the next one is Alaska. Oh, an interview with Eric Peterson, a professor who studies Orthodox missions in America. Let's go.
Hi, this is Bill.
The Orthodox Church is the historical church, the church of holy tradition. And those who count themselves as Orthodox Christians share a uniquely historical consciousness, understanding that the saints, priests, and Orthodox laymen of the past play a crucial part in their journeys toward salvation. However, there is one area of Orthodox history that very few of us know anything about: the story of Orthodoxy in the Americas. Ancient Faith Radio is thus happy to present American Orthodox History with Matthew Namey.
Hello and welcome back to American Orthodox History. This is Matthew Namey, and today I have with me a guest, Eric Peterson. Eric holds a master's degree from the University of Kansas in Russian and East European Studies, and his focus was on Orthodox missions to Alaska. And I have Eric here with us today to speak about the very early Orthodox experience in Alaska from the 18th century into the very early 19th century. So before we begin, I think it might be helpful for us to just have some context. Alaska is a big place. It's a lot bigger than a lot of us down here in the lower 48 can even conceive of. Alaska is larger in size than Texas, California, and Montana put together. It's over 600,000 square miles.
That's right, then including the water, because you have Alaska has a huge island chain, the Aleutian Island chain, that stretches from North America all the way to Russia.
And getting around Alaska in the 1700s would not have been so easy.
No, not an easy task at all. You had to
Let's
have
go grab
good
that real quick because I'm not
navigational
sure
skills
what's
and
going to
basically
be
relying
in
on
this
trails
door.
and rivers.
Now,
Sleep! Should I be putting
Alaskan
something to
territory,
sleep?
it wasn't just one tribe of natives.
Oh no, there were several different tribes and different languages.
Oh
All
no,
tribes got along.
he sounds
There
like
were
he's from
special
Canada.
languages.
Oh
The Russian
no.
explorer, well, he was actually Danish, right? Vitus Bering,
That's right.
discovers Alaska for the Russian government in 1741.
Rediscovers it.
Rediscovers Alaska. And after this point, there are increasing numbers of Russian lay contacts with the Alaskans. Can you talk about that a little bit?
That's one of the most interesting things in the history of the Russian mission. It started when the news comes that they've discovered this huge land, Alaska, that there are lots of fur-bearing animals, which is what the Russians had gone across Siberia looking for, because the furs they could sell to Europe and to China later for a very high price. So you have the adventurers that want adventure, they want money, and they go to Siberia and places like Siberia and Alaska and trap these animals.
Can we talk about how adventure, like I'm playing an adventure game right now. These guys are on an adventure. And a real life adventure means you go risk your life to kill fur animals. See places that you've never seen before. People who might kill you. Freezing cold. I don't know, man. I don't know how we came to think adventures were awesome. Death idols. I didn't see. What are those? Oh, death idols. A talisman strikes fear, making them a little. Oh, well, okay, that's nice. That's nice, honey.
And bring them back to make their living. And so, in a process that was begun in Siberia and then continued in Alaska, you'd have a Russian hunter come into the area, and then he would make sort of an alliance with a local person, a native person, native Siberian, native Alaskan. And because the native Alaskan knew where these things were, knew where the animals were, and then he would sort of make a partnership with that person, a friendship. And through this relationship, they'd go hunting and they'd bring their skins in for trade.
So these were individual Russian men coming over and establishing relationships with individual natives.
Right. Right, that's how it started at first. A Russian hunter would meet, say, on an Aleutian island. He would meet a native chief, because the chief was the person you have to have contact with first. And then through that relationship, they would go hunting, they would share stories. The chief would tell stories of his own people, cultural stories, religious stories. And then the Russian hunter would do the same. And it's through that relationship then that oftentimes a Russian hunter would sort of adopt the chief's son as his godfather, baptize him. Because it was an expedient business relationship for the chief to send his son with the Russian, whom he trusted, back to Russia. His son would learn how to sail ships, his son would learn Russian, would learn more about orthodoxy, and would learn how to react with Russians, because that was the sort of new paradigm coming up on the islands, because there are more Russians coming in, and the chiefs had foresight to think, well, we should learn how to deal with these people.
And then the son would come back and eventually become chief, and he's already Orthodox.
Right. And oftentimes he'd build the first chapel there. Then he would know something of the prayers of the church, and he would do services in the chapel.
Boss monster.
Services.
Wait.
And then his family would be Orthodox. Other people who respected his leadership would learn about Orthodoxy, and they'd become Orthodox. So before the first formal clergy missionaries came to Alaska, you had whole parishes.
And you had intermarriage between
Okay, these guys are
Russians
stronger than the regular ones.
and native Alaskans as well.
Well, that's
correct?
okay. Stop.
Right, right. Unlike several other European groups, the Russians didn't have this sort of ethnic purity mindset. So they've
I
been
pushed the wrong
intermarrying
button.
with non-Russians for centuries. The same in Siberia, and they continue in Alaska.
And the family of this Russian man who married a native woman would be Orthodox.
Right, right. He would baptize his wife and his children. He would teach them about Orthodoxy, and they would grow up and be Orthodox. They would teach their children, and more people would learn from them.
So before, as you say, before there was any formal mission, there were quite a few Orthodox Christians in Alaska.
That's correct.
through the efforts of these laymen who didn't probably even think of themselves as missionaries.
No, I don't think they did.
Now, one of the major events I understand in bringing about the mission, eventually, was the establishment of a trading company in Russia.
Yes, it's called the Russian American Company. At first, it was one of several companies operating in Alaska, and eventually they beat out the competition.
And they were granted a monopoly.
Yes, they were granted a monopoly in the early 19th century.
By the Russian government, I think.
Right, by the Russian government.
And can you tell us, how did this lead to the Kodiak mission?
Okay. Well, the Russian company had gotten together with the Aleuts and the Aleutian Islands and gone to invade the island of Kodiak because the Kodiak Islanders were enemies of the Aleuts. They were also sort of trade rivals. So to get rid of the rivals, get rid of their enemies, they go, they take it over, and it's a very kind of bloody affair. But eventually the Russians established their first capital on Kodiak. And so they build a church, and they bring in more people, and they need clergy, because there aren't permanent clergy yet in Alaska. There's no permanent priests, they're just priests on ships.
So the company's not doing missionary work. They're just going about their business.
They're doing to make money. But, if you want to make money, you have to take care of other things, too. Not just the company employees, but their families. So the company employees and their families were Orthodox.
And so the company sends a request to whom?
To the Russian government, most likely. And the government ponders how we're going to take care of this. And from input from the Metropolitan of St. Petersburg, Metropolitan Gabriel, who asks for monks from Valam. And then Catherine the Great, the Empress, signs off on it, and they go across Siberia.
And this is the famous mission with 8 monks, including St. Herman.
That's correct, yes.
And St. Juvenali, correct?
Yes.
And they trek across Siberia. They reach Alaska. Where do they go, and what do they do?
Well, I think when they arrive at Kodiak, then they're given sort of the lay of the land, what sort of resources there will be for them. And they're also mission-minded because there's a tradition going back for several centuries in Russia about sending monastic missionaries. So they sort of get together and they divide up what territory they're going to go missionize.
Was this what the company, the trading company, had envisioned?
I don't believe so. There were several cases where the trading company actively opposed the missionaries. In one case, they tried to poison St. Herman at least once, and they didn't want the natives to, at least they were treating like they're slaves, to become Orthodox, because that would make them more human.
Harder to enslave.
Harder to enslave.
And you mentioned, not to go off on a tangent, but you mentioned that there were predecessor missions. This was not an isolated mission.
Right. There were missions in Siberia that served as sort of the model for this mission.
Okay. And these were going on for how long before this?
Oh, gosh. Well, St. Stephen of Perm in the 14th century actually starts a mission amongst native Siberians. And so from him and from others after him, they sort of create a missionary model about how to deal with new cultures.
So the Russian missionaries going to Kodiak Island kind of knew what they were doing when they got there.
Yes.
Now, can you tell us a little bit about the missionaries themselves, individual missionaries? What did they do? Where did they go? I understand St. Juvenali was martyred.
Yeah, St. Juvenali, his sort of lot was to go to the Yukon Delta, which is on the Alaskan mainland. And he was martyred there after having made disciples in different places. And then others like St. Herman just stayed sort of near Kodiak on Spruce Island eventually. But before that, before he moved there, he was working with people on the island itself.
And there was an interesting one that I don't think most of us know about, Makari.
Yeah, Father Makari. If I remember right, his island was Unalaska that he was on, which was an island that was already had an Orthodox population.
And you say Unalaska.
Unalaska. That's the name of the island.
Okay.
And he was a very fervent protector of native people who, at that time, were being abused by the Russian American company. So he and several native chiefs went back to Russia to intercede with the Tsar for their people. Of course, he was chastised for this because he left without permission. But eventually, one of the leader of Valam mission, Archimandrite Yoasaf, was made a bishop to sort of counterbalance the Russian American company, because bishops had more authority than just an archimandrite, which he was.
And most of us, when we think of the first bishop of Alaska, we think of St. Innocent.
Right. Well, Saint Innocent was Bishop of Alaska. Father Yosef, Bishop Yosef later, was Bishop of Kodiak. So they didn't give him jurisdiction over other places.
And what did he do? What was his story?
Well, he was another defender of the native peoples, and he was the leader of the group. He was sort of the de facto abbot of the group of 8 monastic missionaries. And so when he leaves Russia after he was consecrated bishop with Father Makary and with the surviving Aleut chiefs, they sailed to Alaska, but then the ship is lost in shipwreck. So then they never make it, and then it's a sort of a vacuum. Just St. Herman is the last surviving member of the Valon mission.
And of course, St. Herman was not himself a priest. He was just a monk.
That's right, just a monk. And he established orphanages, well, one orphanage that he worked at, and a school. And through his work, and through the work of another priest, Father Gideon, who was the Tsar's confessor, who was sent to check out what was happening with the natives and their abuse. Father Gideon actually did several translations of the Lord's Prayer and of several other liturgical texts into native Alaskan languages.
Even before St. Innocent was doing
Even
his.
before St. Innocent. Yeah.
And so there are quite a few Orthodox Alaskans at this point, but not a whole lot of clergy.
No, they were pretty much dependent on the lay people that knew the services. And if they didn't know any services, there's another story that happens later in the 19th century where the people just go into a church and for 2 hours they stand there silently and pray. And they don't have anybody to read the service for them, and they just pray as from their heart the way they know how.
And I think this is a decent point to stop because at about, 1824, St. Innocent arrives and inaugurates a sort of new era in Alaskan Orthodox history. So we'll be discussing that next time, and we'll have Eric back on the program to discuss the next stage of Alaskan Orthodox history, the arrival of St. Innocent.
Interesting.
You've been listening to American Orthodox
You've been
History
listening
with Matthew
to-
Namey.
Hey, thanks for watching. You can find more VODs here on YouTube, as well as other projects, including reviews of games I've played and movies I've watched. You could also stop by the channel, Orthodox Oasis, over on Twitch. Join us live, hang out, say hi, and all that good stuff. Otherwise, thanks for watching. This has been the Orthodox Oasis. My name is Jerome Hieronymus, and may the Lord bless you and keep you always. Bye.